Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The night shift at the gas station. I was 19 when this happened. It was my first job after high school, working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town. The pay wasn't great, but I needed the money for college. My manager told me it would be easy. Just sit behind the counter, help customers, and keep the place clean. What he didn't tell me was how creepy it gets after midnight. The gas station was surrounded by empty fields and old warehouses. During the day it seemed normal, but at night, it felt like being on another planet. I had been working there for about 2 weeks when the weird stuff started happening. It began with small things that I tried to ignore. The automatic doors would open by themselves, even when no one was around. The security cameras would flicker and show static for a few seconds. Sometimes I would hear footsteps outside, but when I looked through the windows, there was nobody there. One night around 2 a.m., I was restocking the candy shelves when I heard the door chime. I looked up and saw a tall man in a dark coat walk in. He didn't say anything, just walked straight to the back of the store where we kept the drinks. I watched him through the security monitor, but something felt wrong about him. He stood in front of the cooler for almost 10 minutes without moving. Just standing there, staring at the drinks. I thought maybe he was having trouble deciding what to buy. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the security camera, I could see his reflection in the cooler door. But his reflection was different from what I was seeing on the monitor. In the reflection, he was looking directly at the camera, looking directly at me. But on the monitor, he was still facing the drinks. I blinked hard and looked again. The reflection showed him smiling now, a wide, unnatural smile. But on the monitor, he hadn't moved at all. My hands started shaking as I reached for my phone to call my manager. But before I could dial, the man turned around and walked toward the counter. When he got closer, I could see his face clearly. His skin was pale, almost grey, and his eyes were completely black. No white parts, no pupils, just solid black. He placed a bottle of water on the counter and stared at me. I tried to speak, but no words came out. He just kept staring with those horrible black eyes. Finally, I managed to scan the water bottle. "That'll be $1.50, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out exact change, but the coins were old and tarnished, like they had been buried for years. As I took the money, his fingers touched mine. They were ice cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. It was like touching a corpse. He grabbed the water bottle and walked toward the door, but instead of leaving, he stopped right in front of the automatic doors. The doors opened and closed, but he just stood there, not moving forward, not moving back, just standing in the doorway. I watched him through the window, and that's when I realized something that made me want to scream. He wasn't breathing. His chest wasn't moving up and down like a normal person. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, he finally stepped outside. I watched him walk across the parking lot toward the dark fields. But here's the thing that still haunts me. As he walked away, his footsteps made no sound on the gravel, and when he reached the edge of the parking lot, he just disappeared. Not like he walked into the darkness. He literally vanished into thin air. I called my manager immediately and told him I was closing the store early. I said I felt sick, which wasn't really a lie. I felt like I might throw up from fear. The next morning, I went back to work and checked the security footage from that night. I fast-forwarded to the time when the man came in. But there was nothing there. The cameras showed me restocking shelves, then suddenly putting my hands up to scan something at the counter. But there was no customer, no man in a dark coat, nothing. On the footage, it looked like I was talking to myself and handling invisible money. I quit that job the same day. I told my manager I found something better, but the truth was I couldn't handle another night in that place. To this day, I still have nightmares about those black eyes staring at me. And sometimes, when I'm driving past gas stations at night, I wonder if other people have seen him too. I never found out what he was or what he wanted, but I'm glad I never have to find out. The House Sitter's Discovery. This happened when I was 22 years old. My aunt asked me to house sit for her family while they went on vacation for a week. They lived in this really nice neighborhood with big houses and perfect lawns. My aunt's house was beautiful, 3 stories with a huge backyard and a swimming pool. She gave me a tour before they left and told me to make myself at home. The only rule was not to go into the basement because they were doing some renovations down there. I thought it was a pretty easy job. Just water the plants, bring in the mail, and keep an eye on things. Plus, they were paying me $200 for the week. The first few days were great. I spent most of my time by the pool, watching TV, and ordering takeout with their money. It felt like a mini vacation. But on the 4th night, I started hearing strange noises coming from the basement. It sounded like someone moving furniture around down there. At first, I thought maybe it was the neighbors. Sometimes sounds can travel through walls in weird ways. But the noises were definitely coming from directly below me. I texted my aunt and asked if she had workers coming to do renovations while she was away. She texted back saying no, and that no one should be in the house except me. That night, the noises got louder. It sounded like heavy objects being dragged across the floor. Sometimes I could hear what sounded like hammering or drilling. I was getting scared, so I called the police. When they arrived, I explained the situation and asked them to check the basement. The officers went down there with their flashlights while I waited upstairs. After about 10 minutes, they came back up looking confused. "There's nothing down there," one of them said. "Just some old furniture covered with sheets. Everything looks normal." They told me that old houses make noises sometimes, especially at night when the temperature changes. They said I was probably just hearing the house settling. But I knew what I heard, and it wasn't the house settling. The next night, I decided to stay awake and listen carefully. I sat at the top of the basement stairs with my ear pressed against the door. Around 3 a.m., the noises started again. But this time, they were different. Instead of furniture being moved, I heard voices. Quiet voices, like people having a conversation. I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell there were at least 2 different people talking. My heart was pounding as I slowly opened the basement door. The voices stopped immediately, like someone had turned off a radio. I called down the stairs. "Hello? Is someone down there?" But there was no answer. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly walked down the basement stairs. Each step creaked loudly, and I was sure that whoever was down there could hear me coming. When I reached the bottom, I shined my flashlight around the room. Just like the police said, there was nothing but old furniture covered with white sheets. But something was different from when my aunt had shown me the basement earlier. The furniture had been rearranged. Pieces that were against the wall were now in the middle of the room. And there was something else. In the far corner of the basement, I could see what looked like fresh dirt piled on the floor. I walked over to investigate and that's when I smelled it. A horrible, sweet smell like rotting flowers. The smell was coming from the dirt pile. I was about to call the police again when I heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy footsteps walking around in the living room right above me. But I was the only one supposed to be in the house. I ran up the basement stairs as fast as I could and looked around the living room. Nothing. No one there. But I could still hear the footsteps, now coming from the second floor. I grabbed my car keys and ran outside. I sat in my car in the driveway and called my aunt. When she answered, I could tell I had woken her up. "There's someone in your house," I told her, trying not to cry. "I think they've been hiding in the basement." She was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my blood freeze. "The basement door has been sealed shut for 5 years," she said slowly. "Ever since my father-in-law died. We sealed it because that's where we found his body. I felt like I was going to be sick. But you showed me the basement when I got here," I said. "No, I didn't," she replied. "I specifically told you not to go near the basement door. It's been locked and sealed since the funeral." I hung up the phone and looked back at the house. In the basement window, I could see a dim light moving around, like someone carrying a candle. I drove to a hotel that night and never went back to the house. My aunt came home early from her vacation and called me a few days later. She said they had the basement inspected, and the seal was still intact. No one had been down there, but they found muddy footprints on the basement door, like someone had been trying to get in from the inside. I never told her about the dirt pile or the rotting smell. Some things are better left unsaid. But I still wonder who was moving that furniture around, and why they wanted me to find that pile of dirt. The camping trip encounter. I was 16 when this happened. My best friend Jake and I decided to go camping in the woods near our town for the weekend. We had been planning this trip for months. Jake's older brother let us borrow his camping gear, and we bought enough food and supplies to last 3 days. The campsite was about an hour drive from town, deep in the state forest. It was pretty isolated, but that's what we wanted. Just us, nature, and no parents telling us what to do. We set up our tent near a small creek and spent the first day hiking and exploring. Everything was perfect. The weather was nice, and we felt like real adventurers. That night, we made a campfire and cooked hot dogs on sticks. We told scary stories and jokes until late into the evening. I remember feeling so happy and free. But around midnight, we started hearing strange sounds coming from the woods around our campsite. It sounded like someone walking through the trees, stepping on branches and leaves. At first, we thought it might be a deer or some other animal. The ranger had told us there were lots of wildlife in the area, so we didn't worry too much about it. But then the footsteps started getting closer, and they sounded too heavy to be a deer, too deliberate, like someone was walking on 2 legs. Jake grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Everything went completely silent, even the normal forest sounds like crickets and owls. We sat there listening for about 10 minutes, but we didn't hear anything else. So we decided to go to sleep, thinking maybe we had scared away whatever animal it was. But as soon as we got into our sleeping bags, the sounds started again. This time, they were coming from multiple directions. Like several people were walking around our campsite in a circle. I was getting really scared, but I didn't want Jake to think I was a coward. So I just lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then we heard something that made both of us sit up immediately. It was the sound of someone or something unzipping a tent. But not our tent. A different tent, somewhere nearby. The problem was, we were supposed to be the only campers in this area. We had checked with the ranger station, and they told us the nearest campsite was over 2 miles away. Jake whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, even though it was too dark for him to see me. We lay there listening, and then we heard voices. Quiet voices, like people trying not to wake someone up. But we couldn't understand what they were saying. The voices seemed to be coming from just outside our tent, so close that I thought if I reached out, I might be able to touch whoever was talking. Jake slowly unzipped our tent flap and looked outside. I could see his face in the moonlight, and he looked terrified. "There's no one there," he whispered, but we could still hear the voices, clear as day. That's when we realized something horrible. The voices were coming from underneath us, from underground. We scrambled out of our tent and moved away from the spot where we had been sleeping. The voices continued, but now they seemed to be following us. Wherever we moved, the voices moved too, always directly beneath our feet, like there were people living in tunnels under the forest. We packed up our camping gear as quickly as we could and loaded everything into Jake's car. The whole time, we could hear the voices getting louder and more urgent. As we drove away, I looked back at our campsite through the rear window. In the headlights, I could see the ground where our tent had been. The earth was moving, like something was trying to push up from below. The next morning, we told Jake's brother what had happened. He laughed and said we probably just heard some other campers playing pranks. But we knew what we heard, and we knew it wasn't human. A few weeks later, I read a news article about the state forest. It said that area had been an old mining town in the 1800s. The whole town had been buried in a landslide, and everyone who lived there had died. The article mentioned that sometimes hikers reported hearing voices in the woods. Park rangers called it auditory hallucinations, caused by the wind blowing through underground caves. But I know what we heard that night, and it wasn't the wind. Those people are still down there, under the ground, still talking to each other in their buried town. And sometimes, when new people come to visit, they try to talk to them too. The online friend. This happened when I was 14 years old. I had just gotten my first computer with internet access, and I was spending a lot of time in online chat rooms. Back then, meeting people online was still pretty new and exciting. My parents had given me the usual warnings about stranger danger, but I thought I was smart enough to be careful. I met this girl in a chat room for teenagers. She said her name was Sarah, and she was 15 years old. We started talking every day after school. Sarah seemed really cool. She liked the same music and movies that I did, and she was funny and easy to talk to. We became online best friends pretty quickly. After chatting for a few weeks, Sarah asked if I wanted to meet in person. She said she lived in the next town over, about an hour drive from my house. I was excited but nervous. I had never met anyone from the internet before. Sarah suggested we meet at the mall in her town, somewhere public and safe. I told my mom I was going to the mall with some school friends. I felt bad about lying, but I knew she would never let me meet someone from online. The plan was to meet Sarah at the food court at 2 p.m. on Saturday. She said she would be wearing a red jacket so I could recognize her. When Saturday came, I took the bus to the mall in the next town. I was so nervous and excited that I could barely sit still during the ride. I got to the food court a few minutes early and looked around for someone in a red jacket. There were lots of people there, but no one who looked like a 15-year-old girl in red. At exactly 2 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah. "I'm here. Do you see me?" I looked around again, but still didn't see anyone in a red jacket. I texted back, "Where are you? I don't see you." "I'm right behind you," came the reply. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Just a family with small kids eating pizza and an elderly man reading a newspaper. My phone buzzed again. "Turn around again." Slowly this time. I turned around slowly, scanning every face in the food court, but I still didn't see any teenage girl in a red jacket. Then I got another text that made me feel sick to my stomach. "I can see you, but you can't see me. That's because I'm not really 15 years old." My hands started shaking as I read the message. I texted back, "What do you mean?" The response came immediately. "I'm 47 years old, and I've been watching you for weeks. I know where you live, where you go to school, and what time you get home every day." I felt like I was going to throw up. I looked around the food court frantically, trying to figure out which person was texting me. Another message appeared on my phone. "I'm the man sitting at the table behind you, the one reading the newspaper. Don't turn around." I felt frozen with fear, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly turned my head and looked at the elderly man I had noticed earlier. He was looking right at me over his newspaper, smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made me want to run as fast as I could. He wasn't elderly at all. Now that I was really looking at him, I could see he was middle-aged, maybe in his 40s. He had been slouching in his chair to look older. My phone buzzed with another message. "Now you see me. Isn't this fun?" I jumped up from my seat and ran toward the mall exit as fast as I could. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran all the way to the bus stop and waited for the next bus back to my town. My whole body was shaking, and I kept looking over my shoulder to see if he had followed me. During the bus ride home, I got several more text messages from Sarah's number. But now I knew it wasn't really Sarah. "You can run, but I know where you live," one message said. "I'll be seeing you soon." When I got home, I told my parents everything. They were angry that I had lied about where I was going, but they were also scared for my safety. We called the police and reported what had happened. They told us to save all the text messages and to call them immediately if the man tried to contact me again. For the next few weeks, I was terrified to leave the house. Every time I walked to school or went anywhere, I felt like someone was watching me. The text messages stopped after about a week, but I never felt completely safe again. I deleted all my social media accounts and didn't go online for months. Years later, I found out that several other teenagers in nearby towns had similar experiences with someone pretending to be a teenage girl online. The police never caught him, but the incidents stopped happening after a while. Maybe he moved to a different area, or maybe he finally got caught somewhere else. I learned a hard lesson that day about trusting people online. No matter how nice someone seems, you never really know who you're talking to. And sometimes, the person on the other side of the screen isn't who they claim to be at all. The new neighbor. I was 11 years old when the new neighbor moved in next door. Our old neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, had been an elderly lady who baked cookies and waved at us from her garden. But Mrs. Peterson moved to a nursing home, and the new person who bought her house was completely different. His name was Mr. Chen, and he kept to himself. At first, my parents thought he was just shy. Some people need time to adjust to a new neighborhood, but there was something about him that felt wrong from the very beginning. Mr. Chen was probably in his 50s, with dark hair and glasses. He always wore the same grey jacket, even when it was hot outside, and he never smiled or made eye contact with anyone. The first strange thing we noticed was that he only came outside at night. During the day, his house looked empty, but after dark, We could see lights moving around inside. My bedroom window faced his house, and sometimes I would watch his windows at night. I could see shadows moving back and forth, but they moved in weird ways. Not like a normal person walking around, more like someone crawling on the floor, or moving on all fours like an animal. My mom told me not to spy on the neighbors, but I couldn't help myself. There was something fascinating and scary about Mr. Chen's house. After he had been living there for about a month, we noticed that our other neighbors' pets started disappearing. First, it was the Johnsons' cat, Mittens. Then the family across the street lost their dog, a friendly golden retriever named Buddy. Within 2 weeks, 3 cats and 2 dogs had gone missing from our block. My dad organized a neighborhood search party to look for the missing pets. We put up flyers and asked everyone to check their garages and sheds in case the animals were hiding. But we never found any of them. One evening, I was in my room doing homework when I heard a strange noise coming from Mr. Chen's backyard. It sounded like digging, like someone using a shovel. I looked out my window and could see a flashlight moving around in his backyard. Mr. Chen was digging holes in his garden, but it was almost midnight. The next morning, I looked at his backyard again. There were several small mounds of fresh dirt scattered around his garden, like he had been burying things. I told my parents what I had seen, but they said maybe Mr. Chen was just planting flowers or vegetables. People sometimes do yard work at night when it's cooler, but I knew it wasn't normal, and I was starting to get really worried about our missing pets. A few days later, I was walking home from school when I saw Mr. Chen in his driveway. He was unloading something from the trunk of his car. It was a large black garbage bag, and it was heavy. He had to drag it across the driveway instead of carrying it, and there was a red stain on the bottom of the bag. That night, I heard the digging sounds again. I watched from my window as Mr. Chan buried the black bag in one of the fresh holes in his backyard. I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about what might be in that bag, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the missing pets in our neighborhood. The next day, I did something that I probably shouldn't have done. While Mr. Chen was away, I climbed over the fence into his backyard. I found the spot where he had buried the black bag and started digging with my hands. The dirt was loose and easy to move, like it had been dug recently. After a few minutes, I could feel something soft and furry. My heart was pounding as I uncovered more of the bag. Through a small tear in the plastic, I could see orange and white fur. It was Mittens, the Johnsons' missing cat. I ran home as fast as I could and told my parents everything. They called the police immediately, and within an hour, there were cop cars all over our street. The police searched Mr. Chen's property and found the remains of all the missing pets buried in his backyard. They also found some other things that I'm not supposed to talk about. Mr. Chen was arrested that same day. We later found out that he had been doing the same thing in his previous neighborhood before moving to our street. The police said he had mental problems and couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong. He's in a hospital now, getting help, but sometimes, late at night, I still look out my window at his old house. It's empty now, with a "for sale" sign in the front yard, and I still remember the feeling I had when I first met him. Sometimes you just know when something isn't right about a person, even if you can't explain why. The substitute teacher. This happened during my senior year of high school when I was 18 years old. Our regular English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had to take emergency leave for a family situation. The principal found a substitute teacher to take over our class for the rest of the semester. Her name was Mrs. Blackwood, and she was unlike any teacher I had ever met. Mrs. Blackwood was probably in her 60s, with long grey hair that she always wore in a tight bun. She had pale skin and sharp, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. From the first day she arrived, there was something unsettling about her. She spoke in a soft, whispery voice that made everyone lean forward to hear her. But the weird thing was, even though she spoke quietly, her voice somehow filled the entire classroom, like it was coming from the walls themselves instead of from her mouth. Mrs. Blackwood told us she had been teaching for over 40 years, but she never mentioned where she had taught before. When students asked about her background, she would just smile and change the subject. The first strange thing we noticed was that she knew things about us that she shouldn't have known. Personal things that weren't in our school records. She knew that my friend Jessica's parents were getting divorced, even though Jessica hadn't told anyone at school. She knew that Brian had been suspended from his previous school for fighting. She even knew about my part-time job at the grocery store, and what time I got off work each day. When I asked how she knew that, she just smiled and said teachers have their ways. But the really creepy thing started happening after she had been teaching our class for about 2 weeks. Students began having the same nightmare. In the dream, we were all sitting in our English classroom, but it was night time and the lights were off. Mrs. Blackwood was standing at the front of the room, writing something on the blackboard, but instead of chalk, she was writing with her fingernails. Long, sharp fingernails that scraped against the board and made a horrible screeching sound. And the words she was writing weren't English. They were in some language none of us recognized, with strange symbols and letters that seemed to move and change on the board. At first, only a few students mentioned having this dream, but within a week, almost everyone in our class had experienced the same nightmare. We started comparing notes and realized that the dreams were identical. Same classroom, same sounds, same strange writing on the board. Even the smallest details were exactly the same. Then students started getting sick. Not regular sick like with a cold or flu. They would come to school looking exhausted and pale, like they hadn't slept in days. Some students complained of headaches that wouldn't go away. Others said they felt dizzy and confused, like they couldn't think clearly. The school nurse sent several students home, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with them. Blood tests came back normal, and there were no signs of infection or disease. But the students kept getting worse. 2 of my classmates ended up in the hospital because they collapsed during other classes. That's when I started paying closer attention to Mrs. Blackwood's behavior during our English class. I noticed that while she was teaching, she would stare at individual students for long periods of time, not just looking at them, but staring intensely, like she was trying to see inside their heads. And the students she stared at were always the ones who got sick later. I also noticed that she never seemed to blink. During the entire 50-minute class period, I never once saw her close her eyes. One day, I decided to test something. I pretended to be taking notes, but I was actually drawing pictures and writing random words in my notebook. Mrs. Blackwood was writing vocabulary words on the board, but I wasn't paying attention to the lesson. I was focused on my doodling, trying not to make eye contact with her. After class, I looked down at my notebook and gasped. Instead of the random pictures I thought I had been drawing, my notebook was filled with the same strange symbols from our nightmares. I had somehow written an entire page of the weird language from the dreams, even though I had no memory of doing it. That night, I called my friend Marcus and asked if he had been taking notes in Mrs. Blackwood's class. He said yes, and when I asked what he had written, he described the same strange symbols. We realized that Mrs. Blackwood was somehow making us write things without us knowing it, like she was controlling our minds during class. The next day, I decided to skip English class. I hid in the library and waited to see what would happen. But around the time when English class was ending, I suddenly felt incredibly tired. I fell asleep at one of the library tables and had the nightmare again. Even though I wasn't in the classroom, I still dreamed about Mrs. Blackwood writing on the blackboard with her fingernails. When I woke up, the librarian was shaking my shoulder. She said I had been asleep for over an hour, and I had been talking in my sleep. But I wasn't talking in English. According to the librarian, I was speaking in some other language she had never heard before. That's when I realized that Mrs. Blackwood's influence wasn't limited to the classroom. She could reach us wherever we were. I went to the principal's office and told him everything that had been happening. At first, he didn't believe me. But when other students started coming forward with similar stories, he agreed to investigate. The principal called the district office to check Mrs. Blackwood's credentials and employment history. What they found was disturbing. There was no record of a teacher named Mrs. Blackwood in the state certification database. The references she had provided were all fake phone numbers and addresses. Even more disturbing, they discovered that a teacher matching her description had been dismissed from schools in 3 other states. In each case, students had reported strange dreams and unexplained illnesses. The principal called the police, but when they went to the address Mrs. Blackwood had given on her employment application, they found an empty lot. She had disappeared completely. The strange dreams stopped after she left, and the 6 students gradually recovered. But many of us still have those pages of weird symbols in our notebooks. I kept mine as evidence of what happened. Sometimes I look at the symbols and try to remember writing them, but I can't. It's like there's a blank space in my memory where Mrs. Blackwood was controlling my mind. I never found out what she was or what she wanted from us. But I'm glad she's gone. Though sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if she's found another school to teach at. And I feel sorry for those students who don't know what's coming. The moving day mystery. I was 15 when my family moved to a new house across town. My dad got a promotion at work, and we could finally afford a bigger place with a nice yard. The house was perfect for our family. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a big basement where my dad could set up his workshop. It seemed like a dream come true. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had lived there for over 30 years. They were moving to Florida to retire, and they seemed happy to sell to a young family. Mrs. Henderson gave my mom a tour of the house and showed her all the little details, like which windows stuck and where the light switches were located. But when they got to the basement, Mrs. Henderson's mood changed completely. She became quiet and serious, almost like she was scared of something. "The basement is perfectly fine," she told my mom, "but I would recommend keeping it locked." We always kept it locked, especially at night. My mom asked why, but Mrs. Henderson just said that some basements are better left alone. She handed my mom an old-fashioned key and made her promise to use it. On moving day, everything went smoothly. The moving truck arrived on time, and we had most of our stuff unpacked by evening. I was excited to have my own room and more space. That first night, I went to bed tired but happy. Our new house was quiet and peaceful, much better than our old apartment where we could hear the neighbors through the walls. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the basement. Slow, heavy footsteps like someone walking around down there. I thought maybe my dad was setting up his workshop, but when I looked down the hallway, I could see light coming from under my parents' bedroom door. They were both asleep. The footsteps continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped. I lay in bed listening, but I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The next morning at breakfast, I asked my parents if they had heard the noises. My dad said old houses make sounds when they settle, and that I would get used to it. But that night, the footsteps started again at exactly 3 a.m. And the night after that, and the night after that. Always the same time, always the same slow, heavy walking. After a week of this, I was getting tired from waking up every night. I decided to investigate and see what was causing the sounds. I waited until 3 a.m., then quietly crept downstairs to the basement door. The footsteps were clearly coming from down there, but the door was locked just like Mrs. Henderson had recommended. I got the key from the kitchen drawer where my mom had put it. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the basement door and slowly opened it. The basement was dark, but I could see a little bit from the light coming from upstairs. I listened carefully, and the footsteps were definitely coming from somewhere down there. I called out, "Hello? Is someone down there?" But the footsteps stopped immediately, just like when I had called out on the first night. I went back to bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about what might be in our basement. The next day, I asked my mom if I could go down there and look around. She said yes, but reminded me to be careful and to make sure I locked the door when I was finished. She also gave me a flashlight and told me to yell if I needed help. The basement was bigger than I expected, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. My dad's workshop area was set up in one corner, but most of the space was empty. There were a few old boxes that the Hendersons had left behind, and some built-in shelves along one wall. Everything looked normal and harmless, but in the far corner of the basement, I found something strange. There was a small door, only about 3 feet high, built into the concrete wall. The door was painted the same color as the wall, like someone had tried to hide it, but the paint was old and chipped, so you could still see the outline clearly. I tried to open the door, but it was locked with a different kind of lock than the basement door. This one was old and rusty, like it hadn't been opened in years. That night at dinner, I asked my parents about the small door in the basement. My dad said he had noticed it too, but he assumed it was just access to the plumbing or electrical systems. But my mom looked worried. She said we should ask the Hendersons about it when they called to check on how we were settling in. A few days later, Mrs. Henderson called to see how we were doing. My mom asked her about the small door in the basement corner. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Mrs. Henderson said in a quiet voice, "That door should stay locked. We never opened it in 30 years, and you shouldn't either." When my mom asked why, Mrs. Henderson said, "Some things are better left alone. Trust me on this." But I couldn't stop thinking about that door. What could be behind it that was so important to keep locked? Maybe it was just an old storage space or a crawl space. The footsteps in the basement continued every night at 3 a.m. But now I was starting to notice something else. The sounds seemed to be coming from the direction of the small door. One night, I decided to go down to the basement while the footsteps were happening. I wanted to see if I could figure out exactly where they were coming from. I unlocked the basement door and crept down the stairs with my flashlight. The footsteps were louder than ever, and they were definitely coming from behind the small door. But there was something else. I could hear a voice, very faint, like someone talking to themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like an old man. I pressed my ear against the small door and listened carefully. The voice was clearer now, and I could hear what he was saying. "Let me out," the voice whispered. "Please let me out. I've been in here so long. My blood ran cold. There was someone trapped behind that door, and they needed help." I ran upstairs and woke up my parents. I told them there was someone trapped in the basement who needed help. My dad grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, and we all went down to the basement together. But when we got there, everything was silent. We listened at the small door for several minutes, but we didn't hear any voices or footsteps. My parents thought I had imagined it, or maybe heard sounds from outside. But I knew what I had heard. Someone was behind that door, and they were asking for help. The next day, my dad decided to investigate. He broke the old lock on the small door and opened it with his crowbar. Behind the door was a small room, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet. But it wasn't a storage space or a crawl space. It was set up like a tiny living area. There was an old mattress on the floor, some empty food cans, and a bucket in the corner. On the walls, someone had scratched hundreds of lines, like they were counting days. And there were words scratched into the concrete, desperate messages asking for help. My dad called the police immediately. When they arrived, they said it looked like someone had been held prisoner in that small room for a long time. The detective asked us if we had ever heard of someone named Thomas Henderson, the elderly man who had lived in the house before us. We said yes, he was Mrs. Henderson's husband. But the detective shook his head. Mrs. Henderson has been a widow for 5 years, he said. Her husband, Thomas, disappeared, and she reported him missing. The police searched everywhere, but never found him. That's when we realized the horrible truth. Mrs. Henderson had kept her husband locked in that basement room until he died, and his spirit was still trapped there, asking to be let out. The police investigated further and found evidence that Thomas Henderson had been held prisoner by his own wife. Apparently, he had developed dementia, and instead of getting him proper care, she had locked him away. Mrs. Henderson was arrested in Florida and charged with murder. She eventually confessed to keeping her husband locked in the basement for over 2 years until he died. The footsteps stopped after the police investigation. I think Thomas Henderson's spirit was finally at peace, knowing that people knew what had happened to him. We moved out of that house a few months later. My parents said it was because they found a better place, but I knew the real reason. None of us could forget what we had discovered in that basement, and none of us could sleep peacefully knowing what had happened there. Sometimes I wonder how many other houses have dark secrets hidden in their basements, and I wonder how many missing people are actually trapped much closer to home than anyone realizes. The school trip. This happened when I was 13 years old, during a school field trip to a historical museum about 3 hours away from our town. Our entire 8th grade class was going, along with 4 teachers and several parent volunteers. We were supposed to learn about local history and see artifacts from the 1800s. The museum was in an old mansion that had been converted into a historical site. It was a huge 3-story building with lots of rooms and long hallways. When we arrived, a tour guide named Mr. Phillips met us at the entrance. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a friendly smile and a deep voice that carried well through the large rooms. Mr. Phillips divided us into groups of about 10 students each. My group included my best friends Sarah and Mike, along with 7 other classmates I knew pretty well. The tour started on the first floor, where Mr. Phillips showed us the original furniture and explained how families lived in the 1800s. Everything seemed normal and educational, but when we got to the second floor, something felt different. The hallways were dimmer, and there was a strange smell in the air, like old flowers or something that had been sitting in water too long. Mr. Phillips led us into a room that he said had been a child's bedroom. There was an old wooden bed, a rocking chair, and toys from over 100 years ago. This room belonged to a little girl named Emma, Mr. Phillips explained. She lived here with her family until she died of pneumonia when she was only 8 years old. As he was talking, I noticed that one of the toys, a small doll sitting on the bed, seemed to be looking directly at me. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's eyes were following me. Sarah whispered that she felt creeped out by the room. Mike said the same thing. Several other kids in our group were shifting around nervously. Mr. Phillips continued the tour, but I kept looking back at Emma's room as we walked down the hallway, and each time I looked back, the doll seemed to be in a slightly different position. The third floor was even creepier than the second. The rooms were smaller and darker. and our footsteps echoed loudly on the wooden floors. "This floor was where the servants lived," Mr. Phillips told us. "It's been preserved exactly as it was in the 1880s. We walked through several small bedrooms and a common area where the servants would have eaten their meals. Everything looked authentic, but there was something unsettling about the whole floor. That's when I noticed that our group was getting smaller. When we had started the tour, there were 10 of us plus Mr. Phillips, but now I could only count 8 students. I asked Sarah if she had seen where Tom and Jessica went. She said she thought they were still with us, but when we looked around, they were nowhere to be seen. Mr. Phillips said not to worry, that students sometimes wandered off to look at things more closely. He said Tom and Jessica would catch up with us soon, but as we continued the tour, more students started disappearing. First it was Amy, then Kevin. By the time we reached the end of the 3rd floor, there were only 5 of us left. I was getting really scared, and I could tell that Sarah and Mike were too. We asked Mr. Phillips if we could go look for our missing classmates. "They're probably just exploring other parts of the museum," he said with his friendly smile. "Don't worry about them. Let's finish the tour, and then we'll all meet back at the entrance." But something about his smile seemed different now, less friendly and more hungry, like he was excited about something that we didn't understand. We walked back down to the 2nd floor, but instead of going to the staircase that led to the entrance, Mr. Phillips led us to a different part of the building. "I want to show you one more room," he said. "It's very special, and not many visitors get to see it." He opened a door that I hadn't noticed during our first time on the 2nd floor. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down to what looked like a basement. The basement was completely different from the rest of the museum. Instead of historical displays, there were just concrete walls and a few bare light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. And there, sitting on old wooden chairs in the middle of the room, were our missing classmates. Tom, Jessica, Amy, and Kevin were all there, but something was wrong with them. They were sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead with blank expressions on their faces. They didn't look at us when we walked in, and they didn't respond when we called their names. "What's wrong with them?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Mr. Phillips smiled that hungry smile again. "They're just resting," he said. "They've learned so much about history today. Now it's your turn to learn." That's when I noticed something that made my heart stop. On a table in the corner of the room, there were several small dolls that looked exactly like our missing classmates. The dolls had the same hair color, the same clothes, even the same facial expressions as Tom, Jessica, Amy, and Kevin. And next to the table was the doll from Emma's room upstairs, the one that had been looking at me during the tour. I grabbed Sarah and Mike by their arms and whispered, "We need to get out of here right now." But Mr. Phillips had moved to block the staircase. "You can't leave yet," he said. "You haven't finished learning about the history of this place. The real history," he continued, "is that this house has been collecting visitors for over 100 years. People come here to learn about the past, and then they become part of the past themselves." I looked at the dolls on the table again and realized what they really were. They weren't just dolls. They were our classmates, somehow transformed into small, lifeless figures. "Run!" I shouted to Sarah and Mike. We pushed past Mr. Phillips and ran up the stairs as fast as we could. Behind us, I could hear him laughing, but it didn't sound human anymore. We ran through the 2nd floor and down to the entrance, where we found our teachers and the other groups of students waiting by the bus. "Where's your group?" our teacher asked. "And where's Mr. Phillips?" We tried to explain what had happened, but the adults didn't believe us at first. They said we must have gotten confused or scared by the old house. But when they went back inside to look for our missing classmates and the tour guide, They found the museum completely empty. No other staff, no Mr. Phillips, and no sign of Tom, Jessica, Amy, or Kevin. The police were called, and they searched the entire building. They found the basement room with the wooden chairs, but there was no one there. And they found the table with the dolls. 4 new dolls that hadn't been there when the museum was last inspected. The museum was closed permanently after that day. The police investigation couldn't explain what had happened to our classmates or to Mr. Phillips, but I know what happened. And sometimes, when I drive past that old mansion, I can see faces in the windows. Small faces, like dolls come to life, watching the road and waiting for the next group of visitors to arrive. The babysitting job. I was 17 years old when I got what seemed like the perfect babysitting job. A family in the nice part of town needed someone to watch their 6-year-old daughter Emma while they went out for their anniversary dinner. The Williamses were a wealthy family who lived in a huge house with a circular driveway and perfectly manicured gardens. Mrs. Williams had called me because she heard from other families that I was responsible and good with kids. When I arrived at their house that Saturday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Williams greeted me at the door. They seemed like a normal, happy couple excited about their date night. Mrs. Williams gave me a tour of the house and showed me where everything was. The kitchen, the living room, Emma's bedroom, and the guest bathroom that I could use. Emma is a very good child, Mrs. Williams told me. She'll probably want to watch a movie and then go to bed around 8:30. We should be home by 11 p.m. at the latest. She also gave me a list of emergency phone numbers and showed me where they kept the first aid kit. Everything seemed very organized and professional. Emma was adorable, with curly blonde hair and big blue eyes. She was shy at first, but she warmed up to me quickly when I asked about her favorite toys and movies. After her parents left, Emma and I made popcorn and settled in to watch a Disney movie in the living room. She curled up next to me on the couch with her favorite stuffed animal, a pink bunny named Mr. Hops. About halfway through the movie, Emma turned to me and said something that made me feel a little uneasy. "Do you hear the other children playing upstairs?" she asked. I listened carefully, but I didn't hear anything except the movie. "What other children, sweetie?" I asked. "My brothers and sisters," she said matter-of-factly. "They live in the attic. Mommy and Daddy don't like them to come downstairs when there are visitors." I thought maybe Emma had imaginary friends or was just being creative. Lots of kids make up stories about invisible siblings. "How many brothers and sisters do you have?" I asked, playing along. "7, she said. "But they're not allowed to eat dinner with us. They have to stay upstairs all the time." This struck me as odd, but I didn't want to make Emma feel bad about her imagination. So I just nodded and turned my attention back to the movie. But a few minutes later, I did hear something upstairs. It sounded like footsteps walking around in the rooms above us. "Are your parents home early?" I asked Emma. She shook her head. "That's just my brothers and sisters. They get restless when they smell popcorn." Now I was starting to feel genuinely worried. Emma seemed too young to have such a detailed and consistent imaginary story, and those footsteps sounded very real. When the movie ended, I told Emma it was time to get ready for bed. She brushed her teeth and put on her pajamas without any fuss. As I was tucking her into bed, she grabbed my hand and looked at me with those big blue eyes. "Will you read me a story?" she asked. "Of course," I said, picking up a book from her nightstand. "Not that one," she said. "I want you to read me the story about my brothers and sisters." She pointed to a notebook on her desk. When I opened it, I found pages and pages of writing in a child's handwriting. The story was about 7 children who lived in an attic and were never allowed to leave. They were hungry all the time, and they missed their parents who lived downstairs but pretended they didn't exist. The story was much too advanced for a 6-year-old to write. The vocabulary and sentence structure were more like something a teenager would create. "Emma, who helped you write this story?" I asked. "My brothers and sisters told it to me," she said. "They want people to know about them." That's when I heard the footsteps upstairs again, but this time they were directly above Emma's bedroom. It sounded like several people walking around up there. "Emma, I need to ask you something important," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are there really other children in this house?" She nodded seriously. "They've been up there for a very long time, since before I was born." I felt sick to my stomach. If Emma was telling the truth, there were children being held prisoner in the attic of this house. "Do you think I could meet your brothers and sisters?" I asked. Emma's eyes got wide with fear. "Oh no," she whispered. "Mommy and Daddy would be very angry. The other children are supposed to be a secret. But don't you think your brothers and sisters would like to come downstairs and play sometimes?" Emma nodded sadly. "They tell me they want to come down and watch movies and eat popcorn. But Mommy and Daddy say they have to stay hidden." I made a decision that might have saved those children's lives. I told Emma I was going to go upstairs and say hello to her siblings. "Please don't," she begged. "Mommy and Daddy will be so mad at both of us." But I had to know if there were really children being held captive in this house. I walked up the main staircase to the second floor, and then I found a smaller staircase that led to the attic. The door at the top was locked, but I could hear voices coming from behind it. Children's voices, whispering to each other. I knocked gently on the door. "Hello," I called softly. "My name is Jennifer. I'm Emma's babysitter." The whispering stopped immediately. "Emma told me about you," I continued. "I'd like to meet you if that's okay." After a moment, I heard a small voice say, "Are you going to tell Mommy and Daddy?" "No," I said. "I just want to make sure you're all right." I heard footsteps approaching the door, and then the sound of a lock being turned from the inside. The door opened slowly, and I found myself looking at 7 children ranging in age from about 4 to 14. They were thin and pale, like they hadn't been outside in months. Their clothes were old and didn't fit properly. But what shocked me most was that they all looked like Emma. Same blonde hair, same blue eyes, same facial features. These weren't random children being held prisoner. These were Emma's actual siblings. "Are you Emma's brothers and sisters?" I asked. The oldest boy nodded. "I'm Michael," he said. "These are Sarah, Jacob, Mary, David, Rachel and Benjamin." "How long have you been up here?" I asked. "Since Emma was born," Michael said. "Mom and Dad said they only wanted one child, so the rest of us had to stay hidden." My heart was breaking for these children. They had been living in the attic for 6 years, with minimal food and no contact with the outside world. "We take turns coming down at night to get food from the kitchen," Sarah explained. "But we have to be very quiet so the neighbors don't know we exist." I knew I had to get these children help immediately. I told them I was going to call the police, and that everything was going to be okay. But Michael grabbed my arm. "Please don't call anyone yet," he said. "Mom and Dad will be home soon, and if they find out you know about us, they might hurt Emma." He was right. I needed to be smart about this. I went back downstairs and called 911 from my cell phone. I explained the situation to the dispatcher and asked them to send police to the house immediately. Then I went back to Emma's room. She was still awake, and she looked scared. "Are you going to tell on my brothers and sisters?" she asked. "I'm going to help them," I said. "They shouldn't have to live in the attic." They should be able to go to school and play outside like you do." 20 minutes later, I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. But it wasn't Mr. and Mrs. Williams coming home early. It was the police. When the officers came inside, I showed them the staircase to the attic. They found all 7 children huddled together, scared but unharmed. Mr. and Mrs. Williams arrived home just as the police were bringing the children downstairs. The look of shock and anger on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They were arrested that night and charged with child endangerment and imprisonment. Emma and her siblings were placed in protective custody. I later learned that the Williams family had moved several times over the years, always to avoid detection. They had been hiding those 7 children for Emma's entire life. The children were eventually placed with loving foster families, and Emma was adopted by a couple who promised to let her stay in contact with her siblings. I still think about those kids sometimes, and I wonder how they're doing now. But I'm glad I trusted Emma when she told me about her brothers and sisters. Sometimes children tell us things that adults don't want us to believe, but we should always listen to them, because they might be the only voice those hidden children have. The summer camp counselor. I was 20 years old when I took the job as a counselor at Camp Whispering Pines. It was the summer after my sophomore year of college, and I needed money for tuition in the fall. The camp was located deep in the mountains of Northern California, about 4 hours from any major city. It was one of those old-fashioned summer camps where kids stayed for 8 weeks and learned outdoor skills. When I applied for the job, the camp director, Mr. Harrison, seemed really eager to hire me. He said they were short-staffed and needed someone who was good with kids and wasn't afraid of being in the wilderness. The pay wasn't great, but they provided room and board, and I thought it would be fun to spend the summer hiking, swimming, and doing campfire activities with kids. What Mr. Harrison didn't tell me during the interview was why they were so short-staffed. I found out later that 3 counselors had quit suddenly the week before camp started, and 2 others had simply never showed up. But at the time, I just thought I was lucky to get the job. I arrived at Camp Whispering Pines on a Sunday in late June. The camp was beautiful, surrounded by tall pine trees and sitting on the shore of a crystal-clear lake. There were about 15 wooden cabins scattered around the property, a main lodge where we ate meals, and various activity areas like a craft cabin, archery range, and boat dock. Mr. Harrison gave me a tour of the facilities and introduced me to the other counselors. There were only 8 of us total to supervise 60 kids, which seemed like a lot of responsibility. The other counselors were friendly enough, but I noticed they all seemed tired and stressed, even though camp hadn't started yet. When I asked about it, they said it had been a long training week. My cabin was called Pine Cabin, and I would be responsible for 8 boys between the ages of 10 and 12. The cabin had 4 bunk beds, a small bathroom, and a common area with some chairs and board games. That first night, before the campers arrived, I unpacked my stuff and tried to get familiar with the layout of the camp. I wanted to be prepared when the kids showed up the next morning. Around 10 p.m., I was sitting on my cabin's front porch, reading a book by flashlight, when I heard something that made me look up. It was the sound of children laughing and playing, coming from somewhere near the lake. But that was impossible, because the campers weren't arriving until tomorrow. I walked down toward the water to investigate, thinking maybe some of the other counselors were testing out equipment or something. But when I got to the lake, there was no one there. The laughing had stopped, and everything was quiet except for the sound of water lapping against the shore. I figured I had probably heard sounds carrying from a neighboring property, or maybe some wildlife that sounded like children from a distance. The next morning, the campers started arriving around 9 a.m. Parents dropped off their kids with sleeping bags, backpacks, and excited expressions on their faces. My 8 boys were typical kids, some shy, some outgoing, all excited about their first day at camp. Their names were Tyler, Marcus, Jake, Bobby, Sam, Alex, Noah, and David. Tyler was the oldest at 12, and he seemed to naturally take on a leadership role with the younger boys. Marcus was quiet and bookish, more interested in reading than outdoor activities. Jake and Bobby were best friends who had come to camp together. They were always laughing and playing pranks on each other. Sam was the youngest at 10, and he seemed a little homesick already. Alex was energetic and couldn't sit still for more than a few minutes. Noah was sweet and helpful, always offering to carry extra supplies. And David was the artist of the group, constantly drawing in a sketchbook he carried everywhere. The first week of camp went smoothly. We did all the typical camp activities: hiking, swimming, archery, arts and crafts, and campfire sing-alongs. The boys in my cabin got along well together, and they seemed to be having a great time. I was starting to think this was going to be the perfect summer job. But during the second week, strange things started happening. It began with Tyler complaining that someone was moving around outside our cabin at night. He said he could hear footsteps on the gravel path and voices whispering outside the windows. I told him it was probably just other counselors doing their night rounds to check on the cabins. But when I asked the other staff members about it, they said no one was assigned to patrol at night. A few nights later, Marcus woke me up around 2 a.m., saying he had heard his name being called from outside. He was convinced someone was standing outside our cabin, calling for him to come out. I got up and looked out all the windows, but I didn't see anyone. I even went outside and walked around the cabin with my flashlight, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. The next morning at breakfast, some of the kids from other cabins mentioned hearing similar things: voices calling their names, footsteps around their cabins, and the sound of children playing outside when everyone was supposed to be asleep. I brought this up with Mr. Harrison, thinking maybe we had a security issue with local kids sneaking onto the property. But Mr. Harrison just smiled and said that camps in remote locations often have strange acoustics that can make normal sounds seem unusual. He said the kids were probably just adjusting to sleeping in a new environment. That explanation might have satisfied me, except for what happened next. During the third week of camp, we took the kids on an overnight camping trip to a more remote part of the property. We hiked about 3 miles from the main camp to a clearing where we set up tents and had a campfire. The kids were excited about sleeping under the stars and telling ghost stories around the fire. Everything was going great until bedtime. We had divided the boys into pairs for the tents. Tyler and Marcus shared one tent, Jake and Bobby shared another, Sam and Alex were together, and Noah and David had the fourth tent. I had my own small tent set up between theirs so I could keep an eye on everyone. Around midnight, I was woken up by David shaking my sleeping bag. He was crying and looked terrified. "There are people outside our tent," he whispered. "They're trying to get Noah to come out with them." I grabbed my flashlight and followed David back to his tent. Inside, Noah was sitting up in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent wall with a blank expression on his face. "Noah," I said softly, "are you okay?" He didn't respond. He just kept staring at the side of the tent like he was listening to something. "They want me to go with them," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "They said they've been waiting for me." "Who wants you to go with them?" I asked. "The other children," Noah said. "The ones who didn't make it home." David grabbed my arm. "He's been like this for 10 minutes. They keep calling his name from outside, and he keeps trying to unzip the tent." I listened carefully, but I didn't hear any voices, just the normal sounds of the forest at night. "Noah, look at me," I said, shining my flashlight on his face. When the light hit his eyes, he blinked and seemed to snap out of whatever trance he had been in. "Mr. Jason," he said, looking confused. "What's happening?" Why is David crying? Noah didn't remember anything about hearing voices or wanting to leave the tent. As far as he knew, he had just woken up to find David shaking him and me standing there with a flashlight. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting outside the boys' tents and keeping watch. But I didn't hear any voices or see any signs of other people in our camping area. The next morning, we packed up and hiked back to the main camp. I didn't mention the incident to the other counselors because I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. But that afternoon, I did some research in the camp's old records that were kept in Mr. Harrison's office. I told him I was interested in the history of the property. What I found made my blood run cold. Camp Whispering Pines had been operating for over 50 years, but it had been closed twice for extended periods, once in the 1980s and again in the early 2000s. Both closures were due to incidents involving missing children. In 1983, 3 campers had disappeared during an overnight camping trip. They were found a week later at the bottom of a ravine about 5 miles from the camp. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, but the report noted that the children had been found in an area that was completely dry. In 2004, 2 more children had vanished from their cabin during the night. Their bodies were never found, despite extensive searches by law enforcement and volunteer groups. After the 2004 incident, the camp had remained closed for 8 years before reopening under new management. Reading these reports, I started to understand why the camp had trouble keeping counselors and why Mr. Harrison had been so eager to hire me. But I also realized that I might be putting my campers in danger by staying. That night, I had a meeting with the other counselors to discuss what I had learned. Most of them already knew about the camp's history, but they had been told not to discuss it with new staff members. "The thing is," said Lisa, who had been working at the camp for 3 summers, "the disappearances always happen during the 4th week of camp, and that's next week." "So what are we supposed to do?" asked Mike, another counselor. "Just pretend everything is normal and hope nothing happens?" "Mr. Harrison says the incidents were just tragic accidents," Lisa explained. "He thinks if we're extra careful and don't let the kids go anywhere alone, we can prevent any problems." But I wasn't convinced that being careful would be enough. Not after what had happened with Noah during our camping trip. "Has anyone else noticed the kids acting strange?" I asked. "Hearing voices, sleepwalking, that kind of thing?" The other counselors exchanged looks, and I could tell they had all experienced similar incidents. "It happens every summer," said Rachel, the arts and crafts instructor, "usually starting in the 3rd week. Kids claim they hear other children calling to them at night. And sometimes they try to leave their cabins," added Tom, who supervised the older boys. "We've had to start locking the cabin doors from the outside after lights out." I was shocked. "You lock the kids in their cabins? What if there's an emergency?" "It's better than having them wander off in the middle of the night," Tom said defensively. "Last summer, we found one of my campers walking toward the lake at 3 a.m. He said the other children told him to meet them by the water. This was getting worse and worse. I was starting to think I should pack up and leave immediately, but then I thought about my 8 boys. They were having such a great time at camp, and they trusted me to keep them safe. I couldn't just abandon them. I decided to stay, but I was going to be extra vigilant during the 4th week. The next few days passed without major incidents, but I could tell the kids were getting more restless and anxious. They complained about bad dreams and had trouble concentrating during activities. Noah seemed particularly affected. He had become withdrawn and quiet, spending most of his time sitting by himself and staring off into the distance. When I asked him if everything was okay, he said he kept hearing his friends calling for him to come play. But when I asked which friends, he couldn't give me specific names. "They're the kids who live in the woods," he explained. "They want me to come see their secret hiding place." David was also acting strangely. He had stopped drawing in his sketchbook and instead spent all his time carving things with a small knife he had gotten from the craft cabin. When I looked at what he was carving, I felt sick. They were small wooden figures that looked like children, but their faces were blank and their arms were reaching out like they were trying to grab something. "What are these supposed to be?" I asked him. "The lost kids," David said matter-of-factly. "They're lonely, so they're looking for friends to play with." I confiscated the knife and told David he couldn't do any more carving without supervision. But that night, I found more wooden figures hidden under his pillow. By Thursday of the 4th week, all of my boys were showing signs of being influenced by whatever was affecting the camp. They were pale, tired, and distracted during the day. At night, they would talk in their sleep, having conversations with people who weren't there, and several times I caught them trying to leave the cabin after lights out. I had started sleeping in a chair by the door so I could prevent anyone from leaving without my knowledge. But I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. The boys needed sleep, and so did I. Friday night, I made a decision that probably saved all of our lives. Instead of staying in Pine Cabin, I moved all 8 boys to the main lodge for the night. I told them we were having a special indoor camping experience, complete with sleeping bags on the floor and esmeraldas made in the fireplace. The boys were excited about the change of routine, and I was relieved to have them in a more secure location. The main lodge was a large building with stone walls and heavy wooden doors that I could lock from the inside. If something was trying to lure the children away, it would have a much harder time getting to them here. I set up my sleeping bag near the door and settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful night. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by the sound of all 8 boys talking at the same time. But they weren't talking to each other. They were having separate conversations with invisible people. "I want to go home," Sam was saying to the empty space next to his sleeping bag. "I miss my mom and dad." "That sounds like fun," Tyler was telling his invisible companion. "But I should probably ask my counselor first." "I don't know how to swim that far," Marcus said to someone only he could see. "What if I get tired?" All of the boys were sitting up in their sleeping bags, having detailed conversations with people who weren't there. Their eyes were open, but they had that same blank expression I had seen on Noah's face during the camping trip. I knew I had to wake them up, but I was afraid of what might happen if I interrupted whatever was occurring. That's when I heard a sound that made my heart stop. From outside the lodge came the voices of children, calling to my boys by name. "Tyler, come outside and play with us. Marcus, we have some books you might like to read. Sam, we'll help you find your way home." The voices were sweet and innocent, like normal kids trying to get their friends to come out and play. But there was something wrong with them. They sounded too perfect, too melodic, like they were being performed rather than spoken naturally. My boys started getting up from their sleeping bags and walking toward the door. "No!" I shouted, jumping up to block their path. "Everyone stay where you are." But they couldn't hear me. They were completely focused on the voices outside, shuffling forward like zombies toward the door. I grabbed Tyler, the biggest boy, and tried to pull him back to his sleeping bag. But he was surprisingly strong, and he fought against me with a determination that scared me. "They're waiting for me," he said in that flat, emotionless voice. "I have to go with them now." I managed to wrestle Tyler to the ground, but the other 7 boys continued walking toward the door. The voices outside were getting louder and more insistent. "Don't listen to the counselor," they called. "He doesn't understand. We just want to show you something special." I ran to the door and made sure it was locked, then stood with my back against it. "Jake, Bobby, stop," I yelled. "This isn't real. You're being tricked." But my boys couldn't hear me. They reached the door and started pounding on it with their fists, trying to get out. The voices outside laughed, and the sound was horrible. It was like children laughing, but there was something cruel and hungry in it. "Let them out," the voices called to me. "You can't keep them from us forever. We've been waiting so long for new friends." I pulled out my cell phone to call for help, but there was no signal. We were too far from civilization for my phone to work. The boys were still pounding on the door, and I could hear them starting to cry with frustration. "Please let us out," Noah begged. "They're going to leave without us." I knew I had to do something drastic to break whatever spell the boys were under. I ran to the fireplace and grabbed a large metal poker. Then I started banging it against the stone hearth as loudly as I could. The clanging sound echoed through the lodge, and finally, my boys stopped pounding on the door and turned to look at me. "Listen to me," I shouted over the noise. "Those voices outside aren't real children. There's something else, something that wants to hurt you." For a moment, the boys just stared at me with confused expressions. Then, one by one, they started blinking and shaking their heads like they were waking up from a dream. "Mr. Jason," David said, looking around the lodge in confusion, "why are we all standing by the door?" "I had the weirdest dream," Jake said. "I thought my friends from home were outside wanting to play." The voices outside had stopped calling, and everything was quiet except for the sound of my boys talking to each other about their strange dreams. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door with a poker in my hands, ready to fight off anything that tried to get in. But the voices didn't return, and my boys slept peacefully for the rest of the night. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Mr. Harrison and told him everything that had happened. At first, he tried to dismiss it as mass hysteria or some kind of psychological suggestion. But when I threatened to call the police and the parents of all the children, he finally admitted the truth. "There have been incidents like this before," he said quietly, "but we've always been able to manage them without anyone getting hurt." "Manage them?" I said incredulously. "You mean you knew this was going to happen, and you didn't warn the counselors?" Mr. Harrison explained that the camp had been built on land that had historical significance to the local Native American tribe. According to their legends, it was a place where children who died too young would gather to wait for others to join them. "The tribal elders warned us about this when we first opened the camp," he said, "but we thought it was just superstition. After the disappearances in the 80s and 2000s, we consulted with the tribe again. They told us that the spirits are strongest during the 4th week of each camping session, but that they can't actually take the children unless the children willingly go with them. That's why we've been able to operate safely by being extra careful during that week," he continued. "As long as the counselors keep the kids from wandering off alone at night, everyone stays safe." I was furious. "You should have told us about this. We had a right to know what we were dealing with. If we told people about the history, no one would want to work here," Mr. Harrison said defensively. "And the camp provides a valuable service to families. Most summers, nothing happens at all." I realized that Mr. Harrison was more concerned about keeping the camp profitable than keeping the children safe. That afternoon, I packed up my things and loaded my boys into the camp van. I told their parents that there had been an emergency at the camp and that I was bringing the children home early. Most of the parents were upset and demanded explanations, but I couldn't tell them the truth without sounding crazy. I just said there had been safety concerns that required the camp to close temporarily. All 8 of my boys made it home safely, but several of them continued to have nightmares for months afterward. They would wake up in the middle of the night, saying they could still hear their friends calling for them to come back to the woods. I never worked at a summer camp again. The experience had shown me that some places have darkness in them that can't be explained or controlled. A few months later, I read in the newspaper that Camp Whispering Pines had closed permanently after an investigation by the State Health Department. Apparently, other counselors had come forward with similar stories after I left. Mr. Harrison was charged with child endangerment, and the property was returned to the local tribe. According to the article, the tribal council planned to perform ceremonies to help the lost spirits find peace and move on to wherever they were supposed to be. I hoped those ceremonies worked. I hoped those lonely voices in the woods finally found the rest they were looking for. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up thinking I hear children calling my name from outside my window. And I wonder if some experiences leave a mark on you that never completely goes away. The 8 boys I was responsible for that summer all grew up to be healthy, successful adults. But occasionally, I get a text or phone call from one of them, asking if I remember that last night at camp when we all had the same strange dream. I always tell them it was just their imaginations, influenced by being in an unfamiliar place and hearing too many ghost stories around the campfire. But we all know that isn't true. We all know that something was calling to them that night, something that wanted to take them away forever. And we all know that if I hadn't moved them to the main lodge and fought to keep them inside, some or all of them might have joined those voices in the woods. Sometimes I think about the children who disappeared from that camp in previous years. I wonder if they're still out there, still waiting by the lake or in the forest clearings. And I wonder if they're lonely, calling out to new children to come and play with them forever. The thought keeps me awake sometimes. But then I remember Tyler, Marcus, Jake, Bobby, Sam, Alex, Noah and David, all safe in their own homes with their families. And I know that whatever was waiting in those woods didn't get them. That has to be enough. Because some battles you win just by keeping the people you care about safe, even if you never fully understand what you were protecting them from. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is refuse to let go, even when everything around you is trying to convince you to give up. Those children in the woods may have been calling for new friends, but the children in my care already had a friend. They had me, and I wasn't about to let anything take them away. Not then, not ever. Even now, 15 years later, I still get Christmas cards from most of those boys. They've all grown up and moved on with their lives, but they still remember that summer at Camp Whispering Pines. They remember the fun parts, the swimming, the hiking, the campfires, and the friendships they made. But they also remember that last night, when something tried to take them away from everything they knew and loved. And they remember that someone stood between them and the darkness, refusing to let them go. Sometimes that's all you can do. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes protecting the people you care about means standing in the doorway and refusing to move, no matter what voices are calling from the other side. And sometimes, the most important lesson you can teach someone is that not all calls should be answered. Some invitations should be ignored. Some doors should stay locked. And some friendships are too dangerous to pursue, no matter how lonely the voices sound when they're calling your name. The boys I protected that summer learned all of these lessons, and they're all still here to remember them. That's how I know we won. The wrong Uber driver. It was a Friday night around 11:30 p.m. and I was leaving my friend Sarah's birthday party in downtown. I had called an Uber because I don't like driving after I've had a few drinks, and I wanted to get home safely. The app said my driver would be there in about 5 minutes, driving a silver Honda Civic. I was standing outside the restaurant waiting, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. When a silver Honda pulled up, I didn't think twice about getting in. The driver was a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Hey, you're going to Maple Street, right?" he asked without looking back at me. I said yes and settled into the back seat, putting my seatbelt on and checking my phone. The first thing I noticed was that there was no Uber sticker on his dashboard or windshield, but sometimes drivers forget to put them up, so I didn't worry about it too much. We started driving, but after about 10 minutes, I realized we were going the wrong direction. "Excuse me," I said, leaning forward a little. "I think you missed the turn back there." The driver didn't respond, just kept driving straight ahead at a steady speed. I checked my Uber app and saw something that made my blood run cold. My real Uber driver was still at the restaurant, wondering where I was. This man wasn't my Uber driver at all, and I was trapped in his car. "Let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "Let me out right now, please. I need to get out." The driver finally looked at me in the rearview mirror, and I saw his eyes for the first time. They were cold and empty, like looking into a dark hole. "We're just going for a little ride," he said in a voice that made my skin crawl. "You looked so pretty standing there all alone." I couldn't help myself. I started panicking, pulling on the door handle, but the child locks were on. The windows wouldn't roll down either, and I felt like I was suffocating. I started screaming and pounding on the windows, hoping someone would see me. The driver just laughed and turned up his radio to drown out my screams. We were driving through an industrial area now, with no people or houses around. Just empty warehouses and dark streets with broken streetlights. I knew if he got me to wherever he was taking me, I might never come home. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the steering wheel. The car swerved hard to the right, and we crashed into a concrete barrier. The airbags went off, and everything went white for a moment. When I could see again, I noticed the driver was unconscious, slumped over the wheel. The impact had unlocked the doors, so I kicked mine open and ran. I ran as fast as I could until I found a gas station with bright lights. The police came quickly after I called them, and they arrested the man. They told me later that he had been doing this to women for months. I was lucky I fought back when I did, because they found rope and duct tape in his trunk. Now I always double-check the license plate before getting into any car, and I never, ever get in without confirming the driver's name first. Some nights I still have nightmares about those cold, empty eyes in the mirror. The babysitting job that went wrong. When I was 19, I was desperate for money to pay for my college textbooks. My neighbor Mrs. Henderson asked if I could babysit her 8-year-old daughter Emma for the weekend. She was going out of town for a business conference and would pay me $200 for 2 nights. That was more money than I had ever made babysitting, so of course I said yes. Mrs. Henderson lived in a big house at the end of our street, surrounded by tall trees. She showed me around the house on Friday afternoon before she left for her trip. "Emma is a good kid," she told me, "but she has a very active imagination. Sometimes she talks about her imaginary friend Tommy, but just play along with it." Mrs. Henderson left around 6 p.m., and Emma and I had dinner together. Emma was sweet and well-behaved, and we watched movies until her bedtime at 9 p.m. As I was tucking her into bed, she looked up at me with wide, serious eyes. "Tommy doesn't like strangers," she whispered, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "He's been watching you since you got here, and he's getting upset." I smiled and told her it would be okay, that Tommy would get used to me. But something about the way she said it made me feel uncomfortable. After Emma fell asleep, I went downstairs to watch TV and do some homework. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps upstairs, like someone walking in the hallway. I figured Emma had gotten up to use the bathroom, so I didn't think much of it. But then I heard her voice, talking to someone in her room. "I know, Tommy, but she seems nice," I heard her say softly. "Please don't be mad. She's just here to take care of me." I could only hear Emma's side of the conversation, like she was listening to responses. This went on for about 20 minutes before everything got quiet again. The next morning, Emma came downstairs looking tired and worried. "Tommy is really upset," she told me over breakfast. "He says you need to leave before something bad happens." I asked her what Tommy looked like, thinking maybe I could calm her fears. Emma's face went pale, and she stared at me like I had said something terrible. "You can't see him?" she asked in a small voice. "He's standing right behind you, and he looks really, really angry." I turned around, but of course there was nothing there. Still, I felt a chill run down my spine, and the hair on my arms stood up. That afternoon, while Emma was napping, I decided to look around the house. In Mrs. Henderson's bedroom, I found a box of old photo albums on her dresser. I was just curious about the family history, so I started flipping through them. Most of the pictures were normal family photos, but then I found something strange. There were several pictures of Emma as a younger child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, but in every single photo, she was holding hands with empty air, like she was posing with someone who wasn't there, or couldn't be seen. At the bottom of the box, I found a newspaper clipping that made my blood freeze. "Local boy dies in house fire," the headline read, dated 3 years ago. The article was about a 7-year-old boy named Tommy who had died in the house next door. The same house that had been torn down and was now just an empty lot. The boy had died in his bedroom when an electrical fire started in the middle of the night. According to the article, he had been trying to call for help but couldn't escape. I realized that Emma's imaginary friend might not be imaginary at all. That evening, Emma refused to go to bed, saying Tommy was too angry. She sat on the couch next to me, staring at the corner of the living room. "He's right there," she whispered, pointing to what looked like empty space. "He says you read about him, and now he knows you know. He doesn't want you here because this is his house now too." As she said this, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. I could see my breath in the air, even though it was summer outside. The lights started flickering on and off, and I heard a sound like crying. But it wasn't Emma crying. It was coming from somewhere else in the house. It sounded like a little boy, sobbing like his heart was broken. Emma started crying too, and she reached out like she was hugging someone. "It's okay, Tommy," she said through her tears. "She's leaving tomorrow. Mom will be back, and everything will go back to normal." I spent that night on the couch with all the lights on, afraid to sleep. Every few hours, I would hear footsteps upstairs or doors creaking open. Once, I swear I saw a small shadow move across the wall in the hallway. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson came home earlier than expected. She took one look at my face and asked if everything was okay. I told her about the newspaper article and what had been happening. Mrs. Henderson sighed and sat down heavily in her chair. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out," she said quietly. "Tommy started visiting Emma about 6 months after he died. At first, I thought it was just her way of coping with the tragedy. But then things started happening that couldn't be explained. Toys moving by themselves, voices in her room, cold spots in the house. I've thought about moving, but Emma doesn't want to leave Tommy behind. She says he's lonely and scared, and she's the only one who can see him." Mrs. Henderson paid me the full $200, plus an extra $50 for dealing with the situation. But I never babysat for them again, even though Emma asked me to come back. Some things are just too scary to face, even for good money. I still live on the same street, and sometimes I see Emma in her backyard. She's always talking to someone who isn't there, playing games with invisible hands. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear a little boy crying next door, even though there's nothing there but an empty lot and old foundation stones. The night shift at the hospital. I was 22 and working as a nurse's aide at the county hospital to pay for nursing school. The pay was decent, but they were always short-staffed on the night shift. So when my supervisor asked if I could work a double shift, I usually said yes. It was a Tuesday night in October, and the hospital was quieter than usual. Most of the patients were sleeping, and the hallways were dimly lit to save energy. I was assigned to the third floor, which was mostly elderly patients recovering from surgery. Around 2 a.m., I was making my rounds, checking on patients and updating their charts. Everything seemed normal until I got to room 314 at the end of the hallway. The patient was an 87-year-old woman named Mrs. Garcia who had hip surgery. She was supposed to be sleeping, but when I peeked in, she was sitting up in bed. She was staring at the corner of her room with a look of pure terror. "Are you okay, Mrs. Garcia?" I asked softly, stepping into the room. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and pointed to the empty corner. "There's a man standing there," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's been watching me for the past hour, and he won't go away." I looked where she was pointing, but I didn't see anything unusual. "There's no one there," I told her gently. "Maybe you were having a bad dream." But Mrs. Garcia shook her head vigorously, never taking her eyes off the corner. "He's tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat," she said. "His face is pale white, and his eyes are completely black. He keeps reaching toward me like he wants me to come with him." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay professional. I explained that sometimes medication can cause hallucinations, especially at night. But as I was talking, the temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly. Mrs. Garcia gasped and pointed again, more urgently this time. "He's moving closer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, you have to see him. He's right there next to you." Even though I couldn't see anything, I felt like someone was standing beside me. The air felt thick and cold, like walking into a freezer. I quickly checked Mrs. Garcia's vitals and gave her a mild sedative to help her sleep. But as I was leaving the room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went to the nurse's station and pulled up Mrs. Garcia's file on the computer. What I found there made my hands start shaking as I read. Mrs. Garcia had been declared dead for 3 minutes during her surgery. The doctors had managed to revive her, but she had been clinically dead. According to her chart, she kept talking about seeing a tall man in dark clothes. She said he had tried to take her somewhere, but she had refused to go. The doctors thought it was just a side effect of the anesthesia, but now I wasn't so sure it was just medication causing her visions. Around 3:30 a.m., Mrs. Garcia's call button started going off repeatedly. When I got to her room, she was sitting up again, pointing at the same corner. "He's back," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And this time, he brought others with him. There are 3 of them now, all wearing the same dark clothes. They keep whispering my name and telling me it's time to go." I stayed with Mrs. Garcia for the next hour, holding her hand and trying to calm her. But the whole time, I felt like we were being watched by invisible eyes. The room stayed unnaturally cold, and I could hear faint whispering sounds. It sounded like voices calling from very far away, but I couldn't make out words. At 5 a.m., Mrs. Garcia suddenly became very calm and stopped looking at the corner. "They're gone," she said with relief. "But they said they'll be back. They told me I can only stay a little longer before I have to go with them." Mrs. Garcia died peacefully in her sleep 2 days later. The official cause was complications from her surgery. Nothing unusual. But I knew the truth, even if I couldn't tell anyone. Those figures in dark clothes had come back for her, just like they promised. I requested to be transferred to day shift after that, and my supervisor agreed. I never worked another night shift at that hospital again. But sometimes, when I drive past the building at night, I see dark shapes in the windows, tall figures in long coats, standing perfectly still and watching the street below. I know they're still there, waiting patiently for the next person who doesn't belong, still waiting to guide lost souls to wherever they're supposed to go. The roommate who wasn't there. When I started college, I was excited to finally have some independence from my parents. I got assigned to share a dorm room with a girl named Jessica, who seemed really nice. We had talked on the phone a few times over the summer before school started. Jessica told me she was from a small town about 3 hours away from campus. She seemed friendly and normal, and I was looking forward to being roommates. When I arrived at the dorm on move-in day, Jessica was already there. Her side of the room was perfectly organized, with everything neat and tidy. She had pictures of her family on her desk and clothes hung up in her closet. "Hey, roomie," she said cheerfully when I walked in with my parents. We spent the day getting to know each other and setting up my side of the room. Jessica was exactly like she had been on the phone, sweet and easy to talk to. My parents liked her immediately and felt comfortable leaving me there. The first few weeks of college went great, and Jessica and I became good friends. We would stay up late talking about our classes, boys, and our plans for the future. She was studying to be a teacher, and she loved working with children. Jessica would often talk about her little sister back home, who was only 8 years old. She showed me pictures of them together, and you could see how much she loved her. But after about a month, I started noticing some strange things about Jessica. She never seemed to eat the food she bought, and it would just sit there and spoil. She never got any mail or packages from home, which seemed odd for a college student. And sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, and she would be gone. Not gone like she had left the room, but gone like she had never been there. Her bed would be perfectly made, like no one had slept in it. But then in the morning, she would be there again, getting ready for class. When I asked her about it, she would just laugh and say I must have been dreaming. One night, I decided to stay awake and see what actually happened. I pretended to be asleep, but kept my eyes slightly open, watching Jessica's bed. Around 2 a.m., I saw something that made me question my sanity. Jessica was lying in her bed one moment, and then she just faded away, like she was dissolving into the air, becoming more and more transparent. Within a few minutes, she was completely gone, and her bed was empty. I sat up and turned on the light, but there was no sign she had ever been there. Her side of the room looked exactly the same, but somehow felt empty and cold. I was so freaked out that I couldn't go back to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jessica was there again, acting completely normal. I tried to convince myself that I had been hallucinating from stress and lack of sleep, but it kept happening night after night, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started doing some research, trying to figure out what was going on. I looked up Jessica's hometown online and found something that made me sick. There had been a car accident 3 months before school started. A teenage girl and her 8-year-old sister had been killed when their car slid off the road. The older girl's name was Jessica, and she had been planning to start college that fall. She had been accepted to our school and was going to study elementary education. According to the article, she had been driving her little sister to a friend's house. It was raining, and their car hydroplaned on a curve and hit a tree. Both girls died instantly, and the whole town had mourned their loss. I stared at the computer screen in disbelief, reading the article over and over. The girl in the pictures looked exactly like my roommate Jessica. Same smile, same blonde hair, same bright blue eyes. But according to this article, she had been dead for months. I printed out the article and confronted Jessica when she came back that evening. "Who are you really?" I asked, showing her the newspaper clipping. Jessica looked at the article and then at me with sad, confused eyes. "I don't understand," she said softly. "This must be about someone else. I'm right here, talking to you, so obviously I'm not dead." But as she said this, I could see her starting to become transparent again. "Jessica," I said gently, "I think you need to let go. Your little sister is waiting for you, and it's time to go to her." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and she looked around the room. "But I was supposed to go to college," she whispered. "I was supposed to become a teacher and help children learn. I had so many plans, so many things I wanted to do." "I know," I said, reaching out to touch her hand. But my hand passed right through hers, like she was made of air. "But sometimes our plans change, and we have to accept that. Your sister needs you more than you need to be here." Jessica nodded slowly, and I could see her beginning to fade away completely. "Tell everyone I was happy here," she said as she disappeared. "Tell them I got to experience college, even if it was just for a little while." After that night, Jessica never came back to our room. I had to explain to the housing office that my roommate had dropped out. They assigned me a new roommate a few weeks later, a girl named Amy. Amy was real and solid and ate actual food and received mail from home. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about Jessica. I hope she found her little sister and that they're together somewhere peaceful. And I hope she knows that she would have made a wonderful teacher. The thing in the woods behind my house. I grew up in a small town surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. Our house was at the edge of town, with about 5 acres of woods behind it. As a kid, I loved exploring those woods and building forts with my friends. My parents always told me not to go too deep into the forest alone. They said it was easy to get lost, and there were wild animals that could be dangerous. But when I turned 16, I thought I was old enough to handle myself. I had been hiking those woods for years and knew them like the back of my hand. One Saturday morning in late September, I decided to explore a new area. There was a part of the woods I had never been to, about 2 miles from our house. I packed some snacks and water and told my mom I'd be back before dinner. The first part of the hike was familiar, following trails I had walked dozens of times. But after about an hour, I veered off into uncharted territory. The trees were thicker here, and less sunlight made it through the canopy. Everything felt older and more wild, like humans had never been there before. I was enjoying the adventure and taking pictures with my phone. But after walking for another hour, I realized I was completely lost. Nothing looked familiar, and I couldn't find any of the trails I knew. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same in every direction. The forest seemed to go on forever, with no landmarks to guide me home. I started to panic a little, but I remembered what my dad had taught me. If you get lost in the woods, stay calm and try to find high ground. Look for smoke from chimneys or power lines that might lead to civilization. I found a tall hill and climbed to the top, hoping to see our house. But all I could see were trees stretching to the horizon in every direction. No houses, no roads, no power lines, nothing that looked man-made. It was like I had somehow walked into a completely different world. I tried calling my parents, but my phone had no signal out there. The battery was getting low too, so I turned it off to save power. I knew I had to find my way home before dark, or I'd be in real trouble. As I was standing on the hilltop, trying to figure out which way to go, I heard something. It sounded like footsteps, but not human footsteps. They were too heavy, and the spacing was wrong, like something very large walking. The sound was coming from somewhere below me, moving through the trees. I stayed perfectly still and listened, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe it was a deer or a bear, something I could scare away by making noise. But as the footsteps got closer, I realized this was something much bigger. Each step shook the ground slightly, like something that weighed hundreds of pounds. And there was another sound too, like heavy breathing or snorting. I crouched down behind a large rock and peeked over the edge of the hill. What I saw down there still gives me nightmares to this day. It looked like a man, but it was at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur. Its arms were too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees. The face was the worst part, like a horrible mix of human and animal features. It was sniffing the air, like it was tracking something by scent. And then it looked up directly at me, even though I was hidden behind the rock. Its eyes were yellow and glowed in the dim light under the trees. When it saw me, it opened its mouth and let out a sound I'll never forget. It was like a roar and a scream mixed together, echoing through the forest. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I crashed through bushes and jumped over fallen logs, not caring about the noise. Behind me, I could hear it coming after me, breaking branches as it ran. It was faster than me, and I could hear it getting closer with every step. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. Just when I thought it was going to catch me, I saw something ahead. There was a clearing with an old, abandoned cabin in the middle. The roof was caved in, and the walls were covered with vines. But it was shelter, and maybe I could hide there until the thing gave up. I ran to the cabin and dove through the doorway, landing hard on the floor. The inside was dark and smelled like rotting wood and dead animals. I crawled into a corner and tried to control my breathing so I could listen. Outside, I could hear the creature walking around the cabin. It was sniffing and making low growling sounds, like a dog hunting for food. I pressed myself against the wall and prayed it wouldn't come inside. After what felt like forever, the sounds stopped, and everything went quiet. I waited for another hour before I dared to look outside. The creature was gone, but I could see huge footprints in the mud around the cabin. They were almost 2 feet long, with what looked like claw marks at the toes. I knew I had to get out of there before it came back. I looked around the cabin and found an old compass on a broken shelf. The needle was rusty, but it still pointed north, which gave me hope. I remembered that our house was northeast of where I had started hiking, so I headed in that direction, moving as quietly as possible. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen for sounds of the creature, but the forest stayed quiet, except for normal bird and insect noises. After walking for 2 more hours, I finally saw something familiar. It was a big oak tree with a rope swing that my dad had hung years ago. I knew exactly where I was now, and our house was only half a mile away. I ran the rest of the way home, not stopping until I saw our back porch. My parents were worried sick because I had been gone for 8 hours. I tried to tell them about what I had seen, but they didn't believe me. They said I had probably seen a bear, and my imagination had done the rest. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't any kind of normal animal. I never went back into those woods alone, and I still live in the same town. Sometimes at night, I hear strange sounds coming from the forest behind our house. Long, echoing calls that don't sound like any animal I've ever heard. And sometimes, I find those same huge footprints in our backyard after it rains. I think that thing is still out there, waiting in the deep woods, waiting for someone else to wander too far from safety and get lost. The house that sold too fast. My husband Mark and I had been looking for our first house for almost a year. Everything in our price range was either too small or in a bad neighborhood. We were starting to think we'd never find something we could afford. Then our real estate agent called with what sounded like amazing news. A beautiful Victorian house had just come on the market at an incredible price. It was much bigger than anything we had looked at, with 4 bedrooms and a huge yard. The price was almost $50,000 less than similar houses in the same area. There must be something wrong with it, I told Mark skeptically. But our agent assured us it was just a motivated seller who needed to move quickly. We drove by the house that evening, and it looked perfect from the outside. The yard was well maintained, and the house had been recently painted. It was in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and friendly neighbors. We scheduled a showing for the next day, excited about the possibility. When we walked through the house, it seemed almost too good to be true. The rooms were spacious and bright, with beautiful hardwood floors throughout. The kitchen had been updated with new appliances and granite countertops. The master bedroom was huge, with a walk-in closet and private bathroom. There was even a finished basement that would be perfect for Mark's workshop. "Why is it so cheap?" I asked the agent as we toured the upstairs. She hesitated for a moment before answering, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Well, the previous owners did mention some minor issues," she said carefully. "Nothing structural, just some weird noises at night and occasional cold spots. Probably just needs some insulation work and maybe a new heating system." Mark and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. We could handle some minor repairs if it meant getting our dream house. We put in an offer that same day, and it was accepted immediately. The sellers seemed almost desperate to get rid of the house quickly. They agreed to our price without any negotiation, which should have been a red flag. We closed on the house 3 weeks later and moved in on a Saturday. The first few days were busy with unpacking and getting settled. Everything seemed normal during the day, but at night things got strange. We would hear footsteps upstairs when we were downstairs watching TV. When we went to check, there was never anyone there, just empty rooms. The footsteps always seemed to stop right when we got to the top of the stairs. At first, we blamed it on the house settling or maybe mice in the walls. Old houses make all kinds of noises, and we figured we'd get used to it. But then other things started happening that were harder to explain. Doors would be open in the morning that we had closed the night before. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly for no apparent reason. We would smell cooking food, even when neither of us was in the kitchen. Mark found this more annoying than scary, and he kept looking for logical explanations. But I was starting to feel uncomfortable in our new house, especially at night. One evening, I was alone in the living room reading while Mark worked late. I heard the sound of a piano playing softly somewhere upstairs. We didn't own a piano, and the house hadn't come with one. I went upstairs to investigate, and the music stopped as soon as I reached the landing. The sound had seemed to come from the master bedroom, but it was empty. I searched every room upstairs, but there was no piano anywhere. When Mark came home, I told him what had happened. He suggested it might have been music from a neighbor's house carrying through the walls, but I knew what I had heard, and it was definitely coming from inside our house. The next day, I decided to do some research on the house's history. I went to the county records office and looked up the previous owners. What I found there made me understand why the house had been so cheap. The house had been sold 4 times in the past 10 years. No family had lived there for more than 8 months before moving out. Most of the sales were listed as motivated seller or must sell quickly. I found some old newspaper articles that mentioned the house specifically. Apparently, there had been several calls to police about disturbances at the address. Neighbors had reported hearing screaming and crying coming from the house at night. But when police investigated, they always found the house empty. One article mentioned that a family had moved out in the middle of the night. They left all their furniture and belongings behind, never to return. The family had told reporters that the house was inhabited by something evil. I printed out all the articles and took them home to show Mark. He read through them but remained skeptical about the supernatural explanations. People love to make up ghost stories about old houses, he said. I'm sure there's a perfectly rational explanation for everything. But that night, we both experienced something that couldn't be explained away. We were lying in bed around midnight when we heard voices downstairs. It sounded like a family having dinner, with conversation and laughter. We crept to the top of the stairs and listened carefully. There were definitely multiple voices, including what sounded like children. Mark grabbed a baseball bat, and we slowly made our way downstairs. The voices got clearer as we approached the dining room. We could hear a man talking about his day at work. A woman was asking the children about school and their homework. It sounded so normal and pleasant, like a happy family gathering. But when we reached the dining room, it was completely empty. The voices stopped the instant we entered the room, and everything went silent. We searched the entire house, but found no sign of any intruders. All the doors and windows were still locked from the inside. Mark couldn't explain what we had heard, and I could see he was finally scared. We spent the rest of the night in the living room with all the lights on. In the morning, we called our real estate agent and asked about returning the house. She told us there was nothing she could do, and we were stuck with the purchase. But she did admit that she had known about the house's history. I should have told you, she said apologetically, but I thought maybe this time would be different. We decided to try living with whatever was in the house with us. Maybe if we respected the spirits, they would leave us alone. But things only got worse over the next few weeks. Objects would move by themselves when we weren't looking. We would find the furniture rearranged in different rooms. The shower would turn on by itself in the middle of the night. And every evening around dinner time, we would hear that phantom family. They seemed to be living their lives in the same space we were, but they were living in a different time, maybe decades in the past. After 2 months, we couldn't take it anymore and decided to move out. We put the house back on the market, pricing it low for a quick sale. Within a week, we had buyers who seemed excited about the bargain. I tried to warn them about what we had experienced, but they just laughed and said they didn't believe in ghosts. We moved into a small apartment and took a huge financial loss on the house. But it was worth it to get away from whatever was living there with us. 6 months later, I saw that the house was for sale again. The new owners had lasted even less time than we had. According to the listing, it was another motivated seller situation. I drive by the house sometimes, and it's usually empty. There's always a for sale sign in the front yard, and sometimes